How will David Haye be remembered in years from now? What kind of legacy will he leave behind? He hasn't officially retired, but for all intents and purposes, he is now retired. He's never going to get a pay-per-view on Sky or any major network again. So for me, he's effectively retired now. So it's time to look back at his career and start to assess what kind of legacy he's left. British heavyweight boxing at a time when David Haye turned pro, and even British cruiserweight boxing, because he turned pro as a cruiserweight, they were both, I think it's fair to say, in the dark ages. I'm not sure if Johnny Nelson was still fighting when David Haye turned pro. I think maybe he was. But no disrespect to Johnny Nelson, he didn't exactly set the boxing world alight with electrifying performances. Johnny Nelson was a good fighter, but he was a safety first guy. He was often accused of being negative, etc. And those accusations were not completely unfounded. He did have a couple exciting performances, but for the most part, Johnny Nelson wasn't regarded as someone that's going to set your heart racing when you watch him fight. Someone who's going to produce spectacular performances. So the cruiserweight division in Britain was in the dark ages, and the heavyweight division was also in the dark ages. In the heavyweight division, you had Danny Williams, who was the best British heavyweight for a number of years. Audley Harrison came along after Danny Williams. You had Michael Sprott, Matt Skelton, and these were tough guys. And I respected all these guys. I actually used to like watching these guys fight, but none of them ever made any kind of impact on the world scene. Danny Williams did have a world title shot against Vitaly Klitschko, but it was a very one-sided fight and he took a terrible beating. He beat a very over-the-hill Mike Tyson, who I think was 38 at the time. But other than those small incursions into the world scene, nothing happened with regards to British heavyweight boxing during this period I'm talking about. And then along came David Haye. He was a highly decorated amateur. He'd medaled, I think it was at the Commonwealth Games. I believe he medaled there. He fought Odliner Solis. That's a fight he actually lost on points. Was it points or did he get stopped? I can't remember now. But still, he turned professional to a fair degree of fanfare. And it wasn't just because David Haye was young and exciting, because he was knocking people out in the amateurs. And a lot of people were talking about him turning pro, and his first couple professional fights. Well, his first fight against Tony Booth, won by knockout. Second fight was another TKO in the fourth. Okay, so he was knocking people out when he first turned pro. That wasn't the only reason why he was being talked about. It was also because of his personality. David Haye has a very bright, and I'm trying to find the words how to describe his personality, but he's a very energetic, animated, bright type of character, David Haye. And it was his character as much as his boxing which got people talking. Because David Haye would call people out. He was brash, I think is the word I was looking for. He was a brash guy. And he was also someone who was into modeling earlier on in his professional career. He used to model for, I think, was it Armani and a bunch of other designer fashion houses. And so he just brought this young, vibrant, brash, fresh new energy to the British boxing scene. You know, when he first came on the scene back in 2002. And a lot of his early fights, some of you may remember, were on the BBC. And actually, interestingly here, just to give you an indication of what kind of character David Haye was, some of his early fights here were in the United States. One of them, I remember him talking about this one, was actually at the Playboy Mansion in Beverly Hills. Yeah, David Haye had a fight early in his career at the Playboy Mansion in Beverly Hills. So he was kind of a boxing playboy, David Haye. That was part of the excitement that he generated. So his early fights were punctuated by all these early knockouts, causing a lot of excitement and what have you. And you'll notice that back when David Haye first turned professional, the cruiserweight limit was 190 pounds. Now, some of these fights, he's a bit over 190 pounds. That's how it used to be. But, that's how it is even today when you're fighting non-title fights, particularly early in your career. It's not so strict when it comes to being on weight. So, yeah, 190 pounds was the cruiserweight limit back in the days before they raised it to 200 pounds. And yeah, he was blowing through people. A lot of these fights were on the BBC. He fought Lalenga Mock on the BBC. This is a guy who is from a French-speaking African country, Lalenga Mock. Some of you guys might have seen this fight. And this is the fight where the first alarm bells started ringing for David Haye, because he was dropped in this fight and hurt badly, very badly. This is the worst David Haye has been hurt in the Lalenga Mock fight in his entire career up until he fought Tony Bellew, actually. In fact, I would argue that Lalenga Mock hurt him more than Tony Bellew hurt him. You go back and watch that fight, he was seriously hurt. Now, obviously, he was hurt against Carl Thompson, but I think it was more fatigue than being concussed. And he was also hurt briefly against Jean-Marc Mormec. But it's definitely my contention that out of all the people he fought, Lalenga Mock hurt him the most, which is interesting because Lalenga Mock was really a light heavyweight, a guy who'd even campaigned at super middleweight. But yeah, he was a wild fighter, Lalenga Mock, and he caught David Haye with a big shot. I think it was high on David Haye's head, maybe on the temple, scrambled his senses, and down went David Haye. So this caused a bit of a stir because people weren't expecting David Haye to be hurt by somebody like this. But anyway, he won that fight by knockout. I remember him hitting Mock with a tremendous uppercut in that fight, and he won the fight. Went on and fought Tony Dowling, Hastings, Rassani. These were pretty well-known journeymen at the time, especially Hastings, Rassani. Arthur Williams, who was a former world champion. Then there was his fight against Carl Thompson. This was for the IBO Cruiserweight World title. We don't count the IBO as legitimate. But Carl Thompson was a veteran cruiserweight who I think was 40 years old at the time. A veteran cruiserweight. And, you want to talk about David Haye being washed up at 37. Carl Thompson was still doing bits at 40. He was supposed to be washed up, but, he took David Haye's in this particular fight. I remember he'd fought a guy called Sebastian Ruffman prior to fighting David Haye. And that was a hell of a fight. Both guys were on the canvas. And Carl Thompson was known for being in up and down wars. He had a tremendous fight with a guy called Ezra Sellers. And Sellers is a very interesting fighter, by the way. But he had a tremendous fight with Ezra Sellers where they were both on the canvas multiple times. If you've never seen Carl Thompson versus Ezra Sellers, I suggest you watch it. It's one of the best fights and the most dramatic fights you'll ever see, with multiple knockdowns and huge punches going in. It's a crazy fight. But anyway, David Haye fought Carl Thompson, and he tried to blast Thompson out early, and it backfired in spectacular fashion. He basically blew himself out. He had no gas left in the tank. Carl Thompson, a veteran who'd been in many, many wars, knew how to survive. He knew how to get through. And a tired David Haye was dropped and then stopped by Carl Thompson in the 5th round. And I remember watching that fight and wondering whether David Haye would be able to come back from this, because you have to understand, I'd seen so many British prospects who have been highly touted suffer defeats like Haye suffered to Carl Thompson relatively early on in their career, and they were never the same afterwards. Once their bubble was burst, that was it. They never went on to achieve anything serious at world level. And it destroyed their confidence really. So that was a make or break moment for David Haye. And when he came back after the Carl Thompson fight, he was able to put, well, from the Arthur Williams fight, he was fighting at 200 pounds. But still, when he came back from the Carl Thompson fight, David Haye had changed. His physique had changed. He was more ripped. He was more lean. And you could tell that the Thompson defeat had motivated him. And in fact, at the time, he said the Thompson defeat was one of the best things that ever happened to him. He changed his diet. He changed his training. He took boxing far more seriously. He was still the playboy, but not so much as he was prior to the Carl Thompson fight. And in fact, he went on a streak between Carl Thompson and probably the Enzo Macronelli fight, where he was a very, very, very serious athlete. You know, where he wasn't going out as much as he was in his earlier days and what have you, where he was just on it when it comes to his boxing. This was before David Haye had become the celebrity boxer. You know, this is when he was just nose to the grindstone, putting in that work in the gym and taking his craft very, very seriously. And that is what the Carl Thompson defeat did for him. It just galvanized his resolve, and he became a very serious operator after the Carl Thompson fight. So yeah, he went on to fight these individuals you can see. Glenn Kelly, I believe he's Australian. He's been around a long time. He fought Roy Jones Jr. at one point. And in fact, it was funny in the Roy Jones Jr. fight with Glenn Kelly. That's one of the fights where Jones Jr. had his hands behind his back. And when Glenn Kelly went for him, Roy Jones Jr. cracked him, I think, with a right hand and dropped him. Special effects. Then, another very impressive performance by David Haye was his first step up since losing to Carl Thompson when he fought Alexander Gurov. Now, Gurov was an Eastern European fighter. I can't remember exactly what country he's from. He might be from the Ukraine. He was 6'5" and he was a big puncher, Alexander Gurov. And David Haye went in there for the European cruiserweight title and blasted the guy out in one round. He landed a tremendous right hand, which Gurov could not recover from. And David Haye cited this Gurov fight as an example of what he does to Eastern Europeans. Because I think David Haye was even claiming that he'd never lost to an Eastern European as an amateur. And he said the Eastern European he fought as a pro, Gurov, who was 6'5", he'd blasted out in one round. And I remember him using this as one of the examples of him, what he does to Eastern Europeans, and saying, this is what I'm going to do to Klitschko. Whenever I fight an Eastern European, they're too stiff, I just knock them out. My style just matches up perfectly with Eastern Europeans, and I blast them out. So I do remember that fight, and I do remember the way he was promoting his performance in this fight and suggesting he would do a similar thing to Vladimir Klitschko, who was also a tall Eastern European. But that was a good performance. His fight against Johansson, I can't remember if I saw that fight. I probably did. At this stage, he was still fighting a lot on the BBC, but I think he might have transitioned to Sky around this point. Sometime after the Thompson fight, he transitioned to Sky. He was with Frank Maloney at the time. That's the guy who was promoting him. His next big step up was against Fragamini. Fragamini was a very good Italian amateur, but prior to that, he fought this guy, Ismail Abdul. Now, Ismail Abdul was a journeyman, I believe, from North Africa, a very, very tough man. And at the time, I don't think Abdul had ever been stopped. And this was the first time, I believe, let me not get this wrong here. Yeah, this was the first time that David Haye was ever taking the distance. And he was actually taking the 12-round distance by Abdul. I can't remember seeing this fight, but I remember the result at the time. And I remember reading about the fight. I think in the Boxing News or Boxing Monthly, one of those publications. And I was like, wow, this Abdul guy must be tough. Managed to go the distance with David Haye, took all his best shots. In fact, let's briefly look at his record. He's actually Belgian, but I believe he's of North African origin. He's got a Muslim name, certainly. He's been stopped once in 37 defeats, Ismail Abdul. Is he still active? Well, he fought as late as 2016, so I guess he's no longer fighting. But to have one stoppage defeat, you know, to have been stopped once in all them fights, this guy must be teak tough. Jesus. Where is his stoppage defeat? Let me. Is it on his pro debut? When was it? Was it before he fought David Haye? After? Okay. Vladarchuk. Oh, we know Vladarchuk, right? We know Vladarchuk. He managed to stop this guy in the 12th round, and that was by TKO. So was that even a knockout, or was it on cuts, or was it, you know, did he stop him because he was fatigued? It was the 12th round. Yeah, this guy, a very, very tough dude, clearly. Very good chin. Anyway, back to David Haye. So, yeah, he fought that Ismail Abdul guy. Then he fought Fragamini for the European. David Haye suffered very bad cuts in this fight. I'm not sure if it was only one cut or several cuts, but he suffered a very bad cut in this fight. Fragamini, undefeated at the time. This was for the European Cruiserweight title. Fragamini, not a big puncher, but a very, very active guy, a relentless guy, a guy who would put on a hell of a lot of pressure. And he had David Haye under serious pressure. It was a tough, tough fight for David Haye all the way through. As you can see, the scorecards were relatively close at the time when he got the stoppage. And yeah, he managed to knock Fragamini out. Or did he actually drop him in the fight, or was he stopped on his feet? I can't remember now. But I remember David Haye just being an absolute mask of blood. His face was a mask of blood, and his blood was all over Fragamini as well, just like a bloodbath, that fight. But he did manage to tough it out and get Fragamini out of there. Then, after the Fragamini fight, he made his first incursion into the heavyweight division when he took on Tomasz Bonin, who was a Polish heavyweight with only one loss at the time, 37-1. David Haye stepped up to heavyweight, blasted out Tomasz Bonin in the first round. And this is what convinced David Haye, I think, that he really could make it at heavyweight. And I remember when he stepped up and fought Bonin, was he saying that he might stay at heavyweight and might not go back down to cruiserweight? I can't remember now, but I do remember the Bonin fight clearly. A lot of people were very impressed. A lot of people said, wow, he looked better at heavyweight than he did at cruiserweight. So, you know, he should stay at heavyweight. He was 217 pounds for that particular fight. But that was his first incursion into the heavyweight division. He came back down to cruiserweight eventually and got a shot at the WBA and WBC World Cruiserweight titles against Jean-Marc Mormec in Paris. This, to me, still stands as David Haye's most complete and impressive performance. I love this Jean-Marc Mormec performance by David Haye. Went into the Lion's Den, into Mormec's backyard. He was behind on 2 of the scorecards at the time of the stoppage, but he boxed to a very disciplined game plan. He showed great punch variety. He was going to Mormec's body. Now, David Haye is not known as a body puncher, but in the Mormec fight, he was doing everything. He was going to the body. He was jabbing a lot, which is something, again, we don't see throughout most of David Haye's career. We don't see a lot of jabbing. In the Mormec fight, there was a lot of jabs. There was body shots. He was shortening punches up close. He was throwing long-range shots. He controlled the distance very well. It was a very tough, competitive fight. As you can see from the scorecards, he was ahead on one of the cards. But on the other 2 cards, being in Mormec's backyard, he was behind. He was dropped in the fight, as you can see in the 4th round. But overall, I think it was his most complete performance. Adam Booth was obviously training him. That's something I forgot to mention. Adam Booth was training him since his pro debut. In fact, Adam Booth was training David Haye from when David Haye was an amateur. And Adam Booth was a coach at Fitzroy Lodge amateur boxing gym. So, yeah, for me, the Mormec performance was David Haye's most complete performance, where he just showed all the tools in his toolbox he showed in that fight. He used very well. He came back from the knockdown very well. It was just a tremendous performance. I love that performance by David Haye. When looking back on David Haye's career, if I want to think about a prime Haye and Haye at his best, I watched the Mormek fight. Or I also watched the Macronelli fight, which was the fight afterwards. And David Haye was very dismissive of Enzo Macronelli. And this is one of the things which also punctuated David Haye's career, especially in his prime, was this supreme confidence / arrogance that he had. He was so contemptuous of people like Enzo Macronelli. You know, Macronelli at the time had only suffered one loss. I think that was to Bruce Scott. Was it Bruce Scott who'd beat Macronelli? Let me just check who'd beat Macronelli. I think it was Bruce Scott, the Jamaican, before David Haye beat him. No, Lee Swaby. Oh, no, maybe Macronelli knocked out Bruce Scott. Did he even fight Bruce Scott? Am I getting it totally twisted here? Did Macronelli fight Bruce Scott? Yeah, he did fight. Okay, no, he knocked out Bruce Scott. Was he down? Okay, he was down against Bruce Scott. All right, that's where I'm getting it twisted. Anyway, yeah, he lost to Lee Swaby very early on in his career. But other than that, Macronelli strung together some very impressive victories. He won the WBO cruiserweight title, and he was knocking people out. You know, you look at Macronelli here. Look at all the knockouts. Early knockouts as well. He's a big, big puncher back in the days, Enzo Macronelli. You know, knocked out Bobby Gunn, Wayne Braithwaite, and all these people he was knocking out. Marcelo Dominguez, he stopped him. Marcelo Dominguez, he, for me, beat Nikolai Valoev. This is a guy I mentioned in my previous David Haye video. Marcelo Dominguez, look at him. 5'9.5", 71-inch reach. You go watch him fight Nikolai Valoev, people, and I'm telling you, he won that fight. They didn't give it to him on the cards, but boy, you can make a good case that he won the fight. And he was grossly overweight. He's only 5'9". Valoev is over 7 feet. You know, and he lost that on a UD over 8. But boy, that was a close fight. He was giving Valoev the business in that fight. Can you imagine a 5'9" guy fighting a 7-foot guy? And it's competitive. Anyway, so Macronelli was a formidable fighter. He was a Frank Warren fighter at the time. David Haye, I think, had just split from Frank Maloney. Maybe I'm wrong, but he split from Maloney around the time of the Mormek fight, or just after the Mormek fight. Let me see. This was a Frank Warren promotion when he fought Enzo Macronelli. And going into this fight, a lot of people were like, oh, it's 50-50. Macronelli's looking good. And, you know, people weren't sure about how it was going to go. But David Haye said, I don't even know why people want me to fight Macronelli, because I'll just bowl him over in a couple of rounds. He was very, very nonchalant and dismissive and condescending of Macronelli. And people were thinking, whoa, is David Haye just deluded here? Like, how could he be so dismissive of a dangerous cruiserweight like Macronelli? And David Haye was saying, oh, well, you know, even heavyweights can't take my power, so there's no way cruiserweights can. These cruiserweights, they shouldn't even be calling me out. And I remember Frank Warren heavily backing his man Macronelli to win, as you would expect. But the fight took place, and even the jabs in the first round were hurting Enzo Macronelli. And that's something David Haye mentioned after the fight. Even the jabs were hurting Macronelli. Macronelli looked very, very nervous and cautious after he'd taken a couple of David Haye jabs. He actually managed to cut David Haye in the first round, which was strange because he really didn't land much. But in the second round, David Haye caught Macronelli moving in. He walked him onto a right hand, a very, very razor-sharp right hand, which hurt Macronelli. He followed up, got Macronelli in the corner, dropped him. Macronelli got up and he was in all kinds of trouble. And I can't remember if the referee waved it off at that point or whether he let him continue. I think he waved it off, didn't he? Because Macronelli was just all over the place. And yeah, David Haye won the fight. That was at the O2. I believe that was his first fight at the O2. And that became his home for a while, the O2, along with the MEN Arena. So yeah, good back-to-back performances against Mormek and Macronelli. And that gave David Haye 3 world titles: WBA, WBC, and WBO. The only one he didn't hold was the IBF. That's why David Haye never became the undisputed cruiserweight champion, even though he used to say he was undisputed. You know, going back to the Boy Who Cried Wolf video, where I was saying David Haye told a lot of untruths. That was another untruth that David Haye used to say. He used to tell people he was undisputed cruiserweight champion. He never was. He never fought Steve Cunningham, who was the IBF cruiserweight champion at the time. But he was unified and he was recognized as the best, David Haye. Although the Cunningham fight would have been interesting. Let's not get it twisted. A prime David Haye versus a prime Cunningham, that would have been an interesting fight. All right. Anyway, he abandoned the cruiserweight division, stepped up to heavyweight. This was around the time he called out Vladimir Klitschko. There was that infamous video where he confronted Klitschko in a shopping center. And as I say, the heavyweight division in the UK was in the dark ages before David Haye came along. But the heavyweight division worldwide was in the dark ages too, because the Klitschkos were ruling over a very, very poor division. There was really no credible contenders out there. There were no contenders out there who were even in shape for the most part. Very few guys with any speed, very few guys with any real power. I know there was Sam Peter and maybe one or two, but very few guys with any real power or speed or athleticism, and certainly no guys with any size. So when David Haye came along and started calling out Klitschko, and he wasn't going to be one of these opponents who's so respectful and then what have you, he was trying to put it on the Klitschkos, and that really shook up the heavyweight division. That gave the heavyweight division an injection of life that it needed, and it also gave Vladimir Klitschko the challenge that he needed, the challenge that he'd been craving. Because Vladimir Klitschko and Vitaly had been, without any real competition. David Haye was a good addition to the heavyweight division. Let's not get it twisted. As much as people were dissing David Haye during this period, as much as people like me were criticizing him, he is what the heavyweight division needed in terms of bringing some interest back. He is. He defeated Monty Barrett, who was a journeyman pretty much at the time, but it was an exciting performance. Then he fought Valiev. That was not an exciting performance. It was a relatively close fight. I think that David Haye was fortunate to get the decision, not because he didn't deserve the decision, but because Valiev was based in Germany, despite the fact he's a Russian. He was based in Germany, and it was often difficult to get decisions over fighters who were based in Germany back then, particularly if you're fighting in a safety-first fashion like David Haye did. But I remember at the time saying that I think David Haye can win a decision in Germany, because people were saying, he will never win a decision against Valiev. And at the time I was saying, I think he can win a decision against Valiev, because David Haye was the money man going into the fight. The heavyweight division was in the dark ages. Nikolai Valiev, I think he was a Don King fighter, but he wasn't popular, Nikolai Valiev. There was nobody worldwide clamoring to watch Nikolai Valiev fight. But David Haye had brought excitement to the heavyweight division and the cruiserweight division, and excitement brings money. So I thought, because David Haye is this new exciting character, I think the politics in this fight will favor David Haye, despite the fact that he's fighting away from home. And that's exactly what happened. I didn't expect David Haye to fight as negatively as he did in this fight, but I did feel that if it went to points, and David Haye had won the fight, that he'd get the decision on the cards because of the politics. So he managed to defeat Valiev. He fought, but he was champion in 2009. He eventually fought Vladimir Klitschko 2 years later in 2011. So there was a 2-year period here where he was basking in the glory of becoming Britain's first world heavyweight champion since Lennox Lewis. And he was milking that WBA belt for all it was worth. He was milking his fame for all it was worth. And these were really the glory years for David Haye. And I'm not talking about the glory years in terms of the fighters he was fighting. I'm talking about personally for David Haye. because David Haye was always a guy who liked the limelight. He liked the celebrity. And I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but if anybody was to ask David Haye, he would probably say these were the best years of his career in terms of just his personal life. You know, this was when he was really becoming a celebrity. This is when he was always eating at Stringfellows. Yeah, he said Stringfellows do a great steak and stuff like that. He was always out and about, enjoying the nightlife on all kind of television programs, calling out the Klitschko's. And, you know, he was loving life during this 2-year period between 2009 and 2011. He was absolutely loving it. And he was still on course to retire by the age of 30. Okay, because this was the plan that him and Adam Booth had before he turned professional. All the way back in 2002, he said that him and Adam Booth were sat in a KFC. I think that KFC is no longer there. Maybe I'm wrong. But the KFC in Marble Arch, I think it was, just near Oxford Street. They were sat in that KFC, and that's when they said to each other, look, we're going to try and go into boxing and make as much money as possible and be out by the time you're 30. You know, by the time David Haye was 30. That was the plan that they hatched before David Haye turned professional in that KFC in Marble Arch. Just David Haye and Adam Booth, two guys. And I really have to admire what David Haye and Adam Booth managed to achieve together, because they came along and released themselves from the clutches of the major promoters in the UK. He was with Frank Maloney early on in his career, but he separated himself from Maloney. He wouldn't sign with Frank Warren, and him and Adam Booth together formed Haymaker. Right? Or at least him and Adam Booth together were running the Haymaker promotions, and they put on several shows as Haymaker. Dave Coldwell was involved in putting on some David Haye shows. In fact, let's look at this Monty Barrett event. Officially, the promoter was Dave Coldwell. Maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe Dave Coldwell would take offense to this, but at the time, David Haye was trying to get his promoter's license. David Haye and Adam Booth were trying to get their promoter's license. And so they were really, Dave Coldwell was like a front man for Haymaker Promotions because he had a license. But from what I understand, he wasn't really the promoter, if you get what I'm saying. It's kind of like Lou DiBella. He officially is the promoter of certain shows, but he's not really the promoter, is he? Or like Warriors Boxing, they're not really the promoters. It's really Al Heyman, but they have to have a front man to front it up because Al Heyman is not officially the promoter. He's only unofficially the promoter of a lot of these PBC shows. And to my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, maybe Dave Coldwell can refute this, he was the front man, but behind the scenes, it was really, you know, Haye and Booth that were promoting the situation. But that was for the David Haye Monty Barrett show. The Valuev was obviously not a Haymaker situation. That was in Germany. The Ruiz, let me go back and see the event. The Ruiz fight, yeah, that was Haymaker Boxing, Adam Booth and Coldwell Boxing. So that was like a co-promotion between the two of them. But pretty much Haymaker were in the game at this point. They were putting on their own shows at the MEN Arena, free from the clutches of the major promoters, bringing in all the money for themselves. You know, I have to admire that. Whenever boxers manage to go solo and are not under the control of a major promoter, I love that. I love that, man. I love to see fighters taking matters into their own hands. It's not always practical, and it's not always every fighter who can do it. It's not always best for every fighter, but when it can be done, it puts a smile on my face to see the fighter getting a larger cut of the money than they would do if they were with a promoter. Anyway, he beat Ruiz in, you know, pretty good fashion. He stopped Ruiz and whatnot. He was a bit heavy for that fight. He was really enjoying his life at this point, David Haye. He was putting on weight in between camps, and he came in at 222 for John Ruiz, which I think was his career heaviest at the time. And Adam Booth, I remember, wasn't happy with David Haye's weight in this fight. I think David Haye might have actually been injured or something, and he had to stop sparring early for the Ruiz camp, if I remember correctly. But still, Adam Booth wasn't happy with his weight. His next fight, you see, David Haye came in way, way lighter, 12 pounds lighter against Audley Harrison. Now, the Audley Harrison thing was a farce. Obviously, it was a pay-per-view fight. Harrison was coming off a pretty exciting victory, actually, a very dramatic victory in his rematch with Michael Sprott. The first fight, Audley Harrison was knocked out cold by a Michael Sprott left hook. The second fight, he was losing. He'd hurt himself, Audley Harrison. I think he'd injured his right shoulder, and he was losing the fight to Michael Sprott for the European heavyweight title. And then in the 12th round, incredibly, Audley Harrison pulled out one left hand and knocked Michael Sprott out cold to gain revenge in incredible fashion. I remember watching that with a friend of mine at the time, and we both jumped up and screamed when Audley Harrison landed that big left hand. It was crazy. It just came out of nowhere. But anyway, Harrison fought David Haye. He was scared to death, barely for a punch. Haye took him out. And this was the first time that most of us had seen Eddie Hearn. Because Eddie Hearn, even though he wasn't promoting this fight, he was representing Audley Harrison as Harrison's promoter. And yeah, that's the first time that most of us saw Eddie Hearn. I'd heard about Eddie Hearn, but I'd never seen him up until the Harrison fight. So yeah, and like I say, it was a farce. And one of the reasons that it was so farcical is that David Haye said that the reason he fought Harrison and picked him as an opponent is because that's who the fans wanted to see him fight. He said the fans wanted to see him fight Audley more than they wanted to see him fight Klitschko. Which was an outrageous claim, but it is what it is. This weight that David Haye was against Audley Harrison was probably his best weight as a heavyweight. The 3 fights here you can see, the Harrison fight, the Klitschko fight, and the Chisora fight, he weighed 210 pounds. Now, obviously, he didn't beat Klitschko, but Klitschko's just too big for him, too skilled for him, and was allowed to get away with too much holding at the end of the day. So I think he would have lost to Klitschko regardless of what weight he was. I don't think he would have done any better against Klitschko if he was heavier. In fact, I think he probably would have done worse if he was heavier, because I don't think he would have been able to get away from Klitschko's punches as well as he did in this fight weighing 210. But regardless, beat Audley Harrison. Then he went into the big crunch showdown with Vladimir Klitschko in Germany. He lost on points. I remember this knockdown wasn't a real knockdown, was it? When he was dropped by Klitschko in this fight. He was kind of pulled to the canvas and the referee called it a knockdown, which was really disgraceful by the referee. The referees back in Klitschko's heyday were so biased in favor of Vladimir Klitschko. It was disgusting, you know. And I'm not saying that Klitschko would have lost this fight if he'd been in there with a fair ref, but it would have been a lot more interesting, because whenever David Haye got close, Klitschko was pulling David Haye's head down with his glove constantly, which is completely illegal. You're not allowed to do that. But the referees just permitted Klitschko to do whatever he wanted back then. It really was a disgusting time. And this is why the heavyweight division was in the dark ages, because of the fact that the Klitschkos, particularly Vladimir, Vitaly wasn't really a dirty fighter, but Vladimir was. And the referees just allowed Vladimir to get away with all kinds of illegal infringements, man. It was terrible. Anyway, Haye lost that fight. He got a lot of stick after the fight because of the toe. And me personally, I didn't give him too much stick because of the toe, because fighters are not going to disclose their injuries before a fight for obvious reasons. They don't want to give anything away. They don't want their opponent to gain confidence and be able to target any type of injury, you know, and not like Vladimir Klitschko can target David Haye's foot unless he steps on it. But he may know that David Haye doesn't have the mobility potentially, you know, if his toe is injured. I don't know how much of a difference a pinky toe being injured has over your performance. He said he had a painkilling injection in it, but he said he couldn't push off properly with the the right leg to land his right hand. I mean, I'm dubious about that as an excuse, to be honest with you. I just think the reason he couldn't land his right hand is because Klitschko was much faster on his feet than David Haye had anticipated. You know, Klitschko's quick on his feet for a big man. He's got good balance. And whenever David Haye tried to load up on that big right hand, Klitschko just, moved out of the way. And the right hand went sailing past. And David Haye, as I mentioned previously, one of his weaknesses is that he will often fall off balance when he misses his right hand because he puts so much into it. And his feet are so far apart that when he, launches the right hand, particularly when he launches it against a much taller opponent, he'll fall off balance afterwards and he's in no position to come back with anything and he's open to being countered. Fortunately for him, Vladimir Klitschko's never been much of a counterpuncher. Vladimir Klitschko's much more of a jabber and a lead puncher rather than a counterpuncher. If David Haye had been in with a serious counterpuncher, he could have been in serious trouble in this particular fight in terms of being caught with counter shots. Anyway, the Klitschko fight was what it was. David Haye pursued a fight against Vitali after the Klitschko loss. Now, one of the significant things here is that this was pay-per-view on Sky Box Office. And Sky stopped doing box office after this. After the Harrison debacle and the Klitschko debacle, and I say debacle because David Haye promised to knock Klitschko out. He promised it was going to be explosive. It turned out to be a very boring fight. And obviously the Harrison fight turned out to be a farce. So these Sky Box Office debacles back to back caused Sky to actually abandon doing box office for boxing for a while. And this is something Derek Chisora actually used to... This was a stick that Derek Chisora used to beat David Haye with because of the fact that Sky were no longer doing box office because of David Haye's two performances here against Klitschko and Harrison, which was a fair criticism that Chisora brought to the table. But anyway, David Haye was pursuing a fight against Vitali. He felt like Vitali was older and more beatable than Vladimir Klitschko. He felt like Vitali was a guy who's not going to hold as much. He felt like Vitali's performances were not as impressive and he wasn't as big a puncher. So we started targeting him. He turned up to the post-fight press conference of Vitali Klitschko, Derek Chisora, where Chisora had put in a good performance, really. He lost, but he gave Vitali Klitschko the toughest fight he'd had since Lennox Lewis. And if you look at the 12th round of the Chisora-Vitali Klitschko fight, it was Vitali who was glad the fight was over at the final bell, whereas Chisora was wishing it was a 15-round fight because he still had plenty left in the tank. And he confronted Vitali after the fight and said, I want a rematch. And that was the infamous fight where Chisora spat in Vladimir's face before the fight. Remember, Derek Chisora was supposed to fight Vladimir Klitschko, but Vladimir Klitschko pulled out twice. And Vladimir Klitschko pulled out twice and then fought David Haye. And that's why Chisora was so mad at Vladimir Klitschko, because he'd kept Chisora out of the ring for like a year with the two pullouts, So Derek Chisora was understandably upset with Vladimir, but he also slapped Vitali at the weigh-in, spat in Vladimir's face in the ring. Hilarious when I think back to... Disgusting, yes, but hilarious because they'd cost Derek Chisora so much money. Vladimir had cost Chisora so much money and taken a year out of his career for no real reason. He didn't give Derek Chisora any compensation for all the money he'd lost on training camps. And Derek Chisora was not a millionaire at this point, people. So you can understand why he was so angry. But anyway, the Chisora fight with David Haye came about because Chisora took exception to David Haye gate crashing his post-fight press conference with Vitali. It turned into the infamous brawl. He glassed me. I'm going to physically shoot David Haye. All the stuff that Chisora came out with. Chisora ended up getting arrested in Germany. David Haye fled the country before he could get arrested. He bashed up Don Charles and Derek Chisora. And Derek Chisora dashed a camera tripod, which actually hit Adam Booth, his own trainer. That was a hilarious incident at the time. A highlight, actually, of David Haye's career was him bashing up Chisora and Don Charles at that press conference single-handedly, and then knocking out Derek Chisora in the fight when they fought. at West Ham. And this was another occasion where David Haye had taken on a Frank Warren fighter. Derek Chisora was with Frank Warren at the time. Warren was backing his man just like he did with Macronelli. And in a similar fashion, because when David Haye knocked out Macronelli, this was a Frank Warren promotion. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Let me just check. Yeah, Queensbury Promotions is Frank Warren. So David Haye went onto a Frank Warren show, knocked out Frank Warren's man, took the belts, took the money, and sailed off into the sunset without being tied to Frank Warren, contractually. And he did the same thing here, like a bandit. He invaded the Frank Warren show, took the money, the pay-per-view money. No, it wasn't pay-per-view, actually. It was Box Nation, wasn't it? Was it Box Nation? This was actually a joint promotion. Tell a lie. It was a joint promotion. So David Haye was joint promoting this fight. Doesn't say what. I'm sure it was on Box Nation anyway. And it was, the Luxembourg Boxing Commission sanctioned that fight, if you remember, because Haye and Chisora had had their licenses suspended. Well, Chisora had had his license suspended. David Haye's license, I think, might have expired. So I don't think he had his license suspended. I'm not sure. But yeah, they managed to get Luxembourg boxing licenses. And there were a lot of fighters who were threatened with losing their license altogether if they agreed to fight on this undercard. And I remember Frank Warren being very defiant. And Frank Warren has taken on the British Board of Boxing Control several times. And he's come out on top, Frank Warren. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he sued. Did he sue the British Board of Boxing Control at one stage and nearly bankrupted them? I'm not sure if it was him or if it was another entity. Correct me if I'm wrong here. It may have been Frank Warren who sued them and nearly put them out of business completely. But yeah, Frank Warren's a formidable figure within British boxing, and he was defiant and he was going to put this show on regardless, because he wanted to get paid and he wanted his fighter to get paid. So the Luxembourg Boxing Commission sanctioned the fight. It was a good fight through 4 rounds. David Haye looked to be gassing when they got into the 5th. But he eventually landed that tremendous left hook, which flattened Derek Chisora, followed it up, and put Chisora away. And say what you like about Derek Chisora, but going into this fight, Chisora had suffered 3 losses previously. One of them wasn't really a loss because he got robbed against Robert Helenius. So for all intents and purposes, Derek Chisora was 15-2. One of his losses was to Tyson Fury, which is no disgrace. And the other loss was to Vitaly Klitschko, which is also no disgrace. So you can't say that Derek Chisora was not a credible heavyweight when David Haye fought him. He was. He was a very, very tough top 10 heavyweight contender. And nobody, before or since, has done to Derek Chisora what David Haye did. Knock him out properly. Tyson Fury stopped him, but that was Chisora being retired on his stool. I don't think Chisora went down in that fight, did he? In the Tyson Fury rematch. So nobody before or since has ever cleaned out Derek Chisora the way David Haye did. So you have to say that that's one of David Haye's best performances. You look at the Mormac fight, the Macronelli fight, and the Chisora fight. They're probably his 3 best performances for me. Some people might throw in the Valuev fight, but, I don't think so because people had beaten Valuev before. Chigayev had beaten him. Holyfield really had beaten him, even though he didn't get the decision. Even Dominguez, even though it was over 8 rounds, you could say Dominguez, you could argue, beat him. So, and I think some of them beat him in better fashion than David Haye did. So I wouldn't class that as one of his best performances. I would say Mormac, Macronelli, and Chisora were his best performances. So when you look back at his resume historically, you're going to say, well, his resume ain't that great. 3 wins and then a win over Valuev wasn't particularly amazing. His resume is not that great. But you could say the same for Vitaly Klitschko, really. Vitaly Klitschko's resume is not that great. Here's the thing. David Haye, at a time when he first burst onto the heavyweight scene, there wasn't a lot of talent out there. The same with the cruiserweight scene. There wasn't that much talent at cruiserweight compared to how it is now. So David Haye was beating whoever was put in front of him at the time. It's not like David Haye took on all the best heavyweight contenders. He certainly didn't. But there weren't that many great heavyweight contenders anyway. Do you understand what I'm saying? So when you look at his resume historically, it doesn't look great. But you have to remember that the talent was very, very thin on the ground at the time. You know? So I think it's a decent resume for the time, beating the likes of Mormek, even Fragamini. You know, Mormek, Fragamini, Macronelli, Derek Chisora. They're decent wins for the time. After that, I mean, his career was effectively over, as we know now. He pulled out of the Manuel Charr fight. He then pulled out of the Tyson Fury fight twice. Was out of the ring for a long time with injuries. Came back against Demori and Jurjai in two of his most farcical performances. That was his career heaviest, actually, against Demori, 227. The heaviest David Haye's ever been. But yeah, farcical fights against Demori and Jurjai, against just awful opponents. Demori taught himself how to box by watching YouTube videos. And Jurjai, I mean, the less said about him, the better. Dylan White called Jurjai the corn snake, because Jurjai called himself the Cobra. And Dylan White was like, no, this guy's more like the corn snake. So yeah, we know all about those fights, and we know about the Bellew fights. So that is a recap of David Haye's career. Overall, I think David Haye was good for British boxing. Yes, he did con the public on several occasions. He was a bit of a snake oil salesman, but British heavyweight boxing was in the dark ages. World heavyweight boxing was in the dark ages. And world, cruiserweight and British cruiserweight boxing was in the dark ages before David Haye burst onto the scene. So I do think he brought a lot of excitement, and he brought a lot of exciting performances. That's one thing I've forgotten to discuss so far in this video, and that is David Haye's boxing style, which was very much patterned on Roy Jones Jr. Reflexes, punching power, speed. David Haye, apart from maybe the Mormek fight, David Haye wasn't really a guy who would try and box with you. And I guess the Chisora fight too, but generally David Haye wouldn't even like to jab with you. He'd like to stay way, way, way on the outside, move around, and when he saw an opportunity, when he saw you off balance, he'd jump in with the big right hand and catch you off guard. This ambush style, this Roy Jones Jr. type style. Now, he wasn't as good or as skilled as Roy Jones Jr. at this style, because Roy Jones Jr. could jump in with all kinds of different punches, left hooks, uppercuts, right hands, and all kinds of crazy shots, triple left hooks and all sorts. David Haye couldn't do all that, but he did essentially try and emulate what Roy Jones was doing, the basic philosophy behind the style of not engaging your opponent in any kind of chess match. Like normal boxing, you're in the middle of the ring, I throw this punch, you block it, you counter with this punch, I counter with, that's the kind of chess match that boxers play with each other. David Haye was like, I ain't playing chess with you. I'm going to stay way, way, way away from you, move around. When you try and lunge at me with something, then I'm going to counter you. Or I'm going to wait for you to get into my punching range. And when you're about to throw a punch, I'm going to beat you to the punch. Yeah, this is David Haye's approach. It's a very simple approach, but it was effective if you've got the reflexes and the power to beat people to the punch or counter them. It's effective. Because again, he's not into blocking this shot and then countering with this one, or, setting things up in a traditional way behind the jab to the head, jab to the body, conditioning you to put your hands in a certain place and then throwing a punch. David Haye didn't do too much of that. He was more a guy who was just ambush, just catch you off balance, catch you off guard, beat you to a punch, or, catch you lunging and then counter. That was his style. And it was an exciting style because he was power punch heavy. He threw a very high volume of power punches relative to jabs. He didn't throw many jabs, but he threw a lot of right hands. I'm not saying he was high volume overall. He wasn't. He was relatively low volume. But in terms of his power punch to jab ratio, he had a high volume of power punches. You understand? He threw a lot of them big right hands, occasionally them big sweeping left hooks like the one that caught Derek Chisora. So it was an exciting style. It was a dramatic style. It was an explosive style. You know, David Haye gave the British public some dramatic and exciting performances. Even in his losses to Tony Bellew, they were exciting fights. You know, the Derek Chisora fight was an exciting fight. The Audley Harrison fight was a farce, but, you know, it was an exciting finish. The John Ruiz fight was an exciting fight. The Monty Barrett fight was exciting. Macronelli was exciting. Mormek was exciting. Bonin was exciting. Fragamini was exciting. Carl Thompson was exciting. You understand what I'm saying? David Haye had plenty of exciting performances. And for that, I think we have to give him credit. I think British boxing at least owes David Haye some credit for bringing excitement to the table. You know, yes, he milked it. When he finally got on top and became a celebrity, he milked it. He sold us some snake oil, but he also gave us some memorable moments. So, yeah, those are my thoughts. Those are my memories of David Haye's career. How will he be remembered? I think he'll be remembered as a very, very good cruiserweight. I don't want to say the second greatest cruiserweight of all time at all, because there are very, very good cruiserweights around today. And it's interesting thinking about how David Haye would do against today's cruiserweights. But certainly when it comes to British cruiserweights, he's up there with Johnny Nelson, you know, maybe the best or second best British cruiserweight of all time. I'll let you guys debate that. Johnny Nelson was obviously cruiserweight champion for a lot longer, but Johnny Nelson never held all the belts that David Haye held, you know? So, yeah, let me know what you think in the comment section, people, about David Haye's career. How are you going to remember him? It's happening. I'm out.